Hi, welcome. I'm Russell Sturgis. I'm the founder and principal of EAP Mentor. Welcome to the second in the series of blogs that I'm doing on creating sustainable change. In the first blog that we did, I discussed the whole concept of the elements that were necessary and identified 6 core elements that were necessary for creating sustainable change. And today I'm going to start with the first of those 6 steps. And the first one is about having what it is that you're going to be focusing on in terms of wanting to change become valuable. And it's being able to answer the question why this is important to you. And ultimately, when it comes to change, and of course what we're talking about for the majority of cases, this is about changing habits. And so this is about having a motivation that's going to sit at the foundation of you being inspired to make the changes necessary to change the habit. Now, invariably, when it comes to changing how we think, how we emote, and how we behave in terms of our habits, there's 3 primary things that sit at the foundation of people wanting to change. The most obvious is pain and suffering. So when people are hurting, whether it's physically, mentally, emotionally, when people are in a place where they're experiencing pain or they're suffering, then they're highly motivated to make change. And so, which just goes to show that there's a gift in our suffering oftentimes, because it's highlighting something that needs attention. And so that's the first of them. The second one is when we see other people who are suffering and we decide that we don't want to head down that path ourselves. And so just recently I've had more involvement, and I've been exposed to the concept or the what happens with aging in terms of watching what my mum's going through. And so what it's highlighting for me right now is that, wow, there's some things that I could be doing differently now that would make it easier for me to manage what I was doing in 20 years' time, for example, as I watch what she's dealing with. And so what we can do, where one is, the first one was about freeing us from the suffering. This second motive is to avoid having the suffering. So we actually come up with ways of being able to stop ourselves from having to suffer, if at all possible. The third motive has nothing to do with avoiding pain and suffering per se. It's primarily having a really clear sense of your self-worth to such an extent that you are naturally motivated to want to choose thoughts, feelings, and behaviours that are going to be self-loving, that really reflect that sense of the worth that you have or feel about yourself. And so, so this is becoming aware of behaviours that move you towards being more self-loving, whereas the other 2 are really about trying to move you away from something. Now, it's kind of much the same in to some extent, but one requires nearly a sense of discipline, and it requires, in many cases, it actually requires us to be determined and willful in order to change what's going on, and oftentimes against what it is that we really want for ourselves. In other words, we're not wanting to go down those particular paths, but we know we've got to do them. Whereas when we're coming from the third one, which is really about being motivated from a place of self-love, The choices that we make are really easy because they're choices that really reflect what's loving and supportive. And so it's nearly like there's no will or discipline required to do those things because we would naturally choose them as an expression of being more loving to ourselves. Now, the thing about all of this is that what we're doing by virtue of whether it's pain or whether it's love, whether it's fear or whether it's love that's motivating our behaviour, what we're doing is creating a reason and therefore giving value to why going down this path of making these choices is important. And so the very first step is really that you need to become clear of what the value is in you going down this particular route. And of course, as we've discussed in other videos, and I'll reiterate it here and I talk about it in the actual blog when I write about it there, is that we will only invest our time and resources, money, our skill, and as I said, our time, into what it is that we value. And so if we don't have a clear sense that adopting a new way of thinking, adopting a new way of emoting and behaving is important, then we won't put any effort into creating those changes. Now, we might for a time, if there's some short-term value, but in terms of sustainability, and of course that's what we're talking about here, is that the real sustainability around this, and this is what I'll discuss in a minute, comes out of our capacity to be motivated from a self-loving perspective. Because it's in that reality, in that context, that we actually find the motive to sustainably put our resources into creating the awareness and the mindfulness necessary to be able to bring about those changes. So the thing that blocks our capacity to be able to make changes is ignorance. In the Buddhist philosophy, Buddha referred to the three things that block our transformation as the three poisons. And from a languaging from a Western perspective, that was essentially ignorance, where you don't know that you don't know, you just don't have the information about why change is necessary and how to change. Avoidance, which is the second one, that's where you've been given knowledge and you've been given information, but the change, you're not motivated to change, there's no value, you don't see the value. Certainly you might be able to rationalise that there's a value, but not enough that it's bringing about change. And then the third one, and I'm using a Western word to describe this, which is awareness, and which is attachment. And attachment is where you see the value in wanting to change, you understand why it's important, and you exercise the will and the discipline, which means you're putting the energy into it, but it's not sustainable. So no matter how hard you try, you find yourself stubbing your toe and falling back into old habits and repeating the old patterns, and it's unsustainable. So the remedy to ignorance in particular is awareness. And awareness, to become aware, means to have more understanding. It means that you have more information. It means that you have a greater appreciation of. We think of awareness as sort of being present to, and so therefore it's more clearly in your consciousness. You might be aware of the route to work. I mean, I'm sure many of you have driven to work totally unaware, and you've got from point A to point B without even being conscious of what went on from when you hopped in the car at home to when you got to work. Awareness is being present to that, but it's more than that. Awareness is having a depth of knowledge and understanding that really brings in a greater appreciation. So, for example, it might be that in developing greater awareness about how you go to work, you might ascertain that you might be better off walking and catching public transport. And by that, you're improving your health and well-being through exercise. You might be putting a smaller footprint on the planet in terms of carbon emissions, carbon dioxide, etc., etc. So in other words, there's awareness and then there's awareness. And so awareness in its sustainable context, so in other words, this is another level of awareness, has to do with how is this going to be really loving to me? How is this choice going to be really supportive and kind to who I am, and what's going to be good for me, and what's going to support and sustain my well-being while being kind to others and to the environment. And so when we're able to all of a sudden develop the knowledge and understanding that really extends from the appreciation of what the truly self-loving expression in this is, at that point, when creating a value in an alternative set of behaviours that become an expression of self-love. And as we develop a greater appreciation of our worth and value, then all of a sudden they're the choices that we naturally start being inclined to make. And of course, in mindfulness, we talk about observing the choice, not making the choice. And of course, the self-loving alternative really is a fully padded out awareness of what the choices are, and holding that fully padded out awareness in each moment, so that we have the ability, in being mindful, to start creating new neural pathways along this more self-loving alternative. And I did a series on mindfulness there back in 2017, and you'll find them on the EAP website page, where I talk about this whole idea of instead of driving to work, exercising and catching a bus, and developing the mindfulness around that. And it may be that you bring it into your awareness and you may not act on it for months. And then all of a sudden one day, because you keep on thinking about it, one day you go, do you know what, I might try and catch the bus today. Now, you may not be ready for it because you may not have the travel card necessary to catch the bus. You may not know what the program is, but that may be enough to motivate you to go out and begin to do the research about it. And it still may be another month before you say, today I'm going to catch the bus, and you begin to do it. So what happens in this, of course, when we're dealing with pain and suffering, we've actually got to act on things straight away, and we're pushed into triage in the sense that we've got to actually use will and discipline to change what we're doing. If we don't, we're going to die, or we're going to be in more pain, and we're forced to have to start to engage in behaviours by virtue of the fact that we've got to reduce the pain. In order to avoid pain, we might be aware of what it is that we've got to do, but once again, it may be just too far in the distance in terms of the motivation, and so we may not establish enough of a value in that unless we see something really strongly emotive, unless we see somebody close to us die or experience a lot of pain where it really does then begin to impact on us, and then we find the motivation to start to behave. But once again, oftentimes it's driven by fear of the pain, fear of the suffering, as opposed to being motivated by love. And so ultimately this is about being able to come up with a greater sense of your own worth. And of course, fundamental to what we do in the Enhances Awareness program in an EAP Mentor is a really big part of being able to establish that sense of self-worth is being able to move beyond the narrative that emerged from your formative years that had you believe that there was a lack of worth. And so an intrinsic part of what we do is to help you explore a very real and a very expanded understanding of your real worth. And when you're able to begin to sort of see that and sustain that, then it makes it much easier to want to act in a more loving way as opposed to being motivated by fear. So the first in the steps towards sustainable change is having this become something of a value, that having it be something that's valuable, something that's going to motivate you. Now, obviously fear's a good motivator, but it's not the sustainable one. The only sustainable motive here is one that's oriented and based in love. And when love is the motivation, then, and in this particular case, we're talking about love that comes from a true sense of one's worth, then you are naturally motivated to, first of all, be mindful of the choices, and then in mindful and being committed to maintaining that mindfulness, developing the new neural pathways that automatically leads to the adoption of a new set of behaviours. Okay, well, thank you so much for taking an opportunity to watch the video and read the blog. As we go through the series, we're going to be once again uncovering in each of these sessions the steps that are necessary, and I look forward to sharing with you part 2 in that sequence. I'll speak to you again then. Bye.